Hi, I'm Jeremy Crosby.
And I'm Nick Boucher. We're the hosts for the program that's all about your city, Talking Fitchburg.
Every day, we pull together the news, events, and information you need to stay on top of what's happening in the city of Fitchburg.
Find Talking Fitchburg on cable TV, Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and our live stream on the web. Plus, you can view all our headlines and stories on Facebook, YouTube, and our video on demand service. This is your city.
Keep up with Talking Fitchburg and the issues that affect you and your neighbors.
Want to know what's happening in your city? Get Notify Me messages from the City of Fitchburg. Visit fitchburgwi.gov on your computer or mobile device and select the big Notify Me button on the left. Enter your email and/or phone number, whichever is best for you to get notifications. Scroll down the list and select all the topics you're interested in to receive email or text messages about. You'll be notified every time one of your topics is updated. Sign up for Notify Me, one more way to keep up with your Fitchburg government.
Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our 5th steering committee meeting for the Greenfield neighborhood plan. We're very excited to have you here this evening. Just want to go over a couple of items as we kick off our meeting. The first thing is just a reminder of our agenda this evening. We will begin with Steve with MSA giving us a short presentation, and our next section of the agenda this evening allows the steering committee to discuss and do their work. So I'll just remind everyone and myself that this is a steering committee meeting, and it's noticed as a working session for our steering committee. After the steering committee has completed their work, that is when we will open up for public comment. And there are some half sheets that are just outside of the door here. I just ask for you to fill out those. If you would like to have a public comment, give those to me. And once again, towards the end of the meeting, that's when we'll open up for public comments. And just so that, and I will bring around a microphone for you all to do that. So please fill out one of the forms so that we can get you into the queue for any public comments. Our wonderful FACTv team has set up the room and also provided a breakout space if there's a need for some overflow in this room. It seems like we're doing pretty good in terms of the numbers in this room, but there is a monitor with audio and some benches just outside of the door and to your left. So once again, we welcome you and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Deanna. Steering committee. So we did want to go through some pieces that we haven't in the past. So there was a lot more public engagement that we've talked about in the previous meetings. We're kind of focusing on the open house and the online survey and some of this information here, talking about goals, design preference, the concepts, and goals and strategies. Then we'll talk about updates to the land use scenario as a starting point for our conversation tonight. Talk a little bit about development process and where we're at in the timeline. And then we'll do the activity of trying to get to a preferred concept. That's the ultimate goal tonight so that we can start looking at engineering impacts. And then we'll have the public comment. So again, the purpose of this plan, establish preferred land use that balances growth while considering impacts and other community interests, meet land use, housing, economic development needs, and position the city for an urban service area amendment to allow for sanitary to extend into this area at some point in the future. So a little bit about there. So if you didn't take the survey, there was a survey that had imagery for each of the kind of the densities of land use to see what is appropriate potentially in the neighborhood. We did ask questions between local roads to collector roads to west of the tracks or east of the tracks. And so you're seeing some of the imagery that at least a third of the public felt it was okay or appropriate for the area. You'll see that local roads, you're seeing primarily single-family and duplexes in that, but on the other side, you see what on collector streets, it does expand a little bit with, there's a fourplex there in the middle image there. There's also a townhomes in the lower right. But again, single-family and duplex was still ringing through as the highest of appropriateness, but there was a little bit more openness to a little bit different housing format. East of the tracks, you see a little bit more expansion on the housing side of even up to what you see is an apartment building. Then the townhomes and a little denser single family is appropriate. For commercial industrial, which is only asked about the east side of the tracks per feedback we've received over this process, is showing the commercial and business park uses that were appropriate based on the online survey. So at the open house, we had nearly 100 people that has signed in. There might have been a few others. One of the things we did as an exercise is we had some survey responses at that point, and we looked at some of the general comments, and we created this pyramid, if you weren't there, of these comments and said, what are the least to highest concerns of these comments we've received in the survey thus far? Highest concern was need to preserve the character of the neighborhood. Moderate to high concern was increased traffic pattern in businesses at Sayin and Irish Lane intersections and preserving farmland. And moderate concern is highway interchange, commercial land uses on the west side of the tracks, and generally storm flooding or basement issues that has happened. So we had the two land use concepts that you reviewed previously presented there, and with no change. You'll see there's a bunch of dots on here. It's the same maps. Actually, I don't think we put them out because of the space of the room, but we categorized them by category, and this is going to be in GIS, and it could be available online. But just noting that we had 46 comments on scenario 1, 62 comments on scenario 2. Summarizing those comments is lighted here: road connections and extensions. There's opposition to connecting or extending roads into the neighborhood due to the disruption and the increased traffic through the neighborhood. High-density housing will change the neighborhood's character and increase flooding risk. Business development, particularly near residential neighborhoods, causing increased traffic and noise. Environmental and flooding, and need for buffers and preservation. So in our previous steering committee meeting, we went over some goals, and we've modified those under these categories of housing, job growth and employment, quality of life, sustainability, and transportation. At the open house, we brought in some draft strategies that go underneath those goals, so that wasn't shared previously to the steering committee. We did make it known during the open house that these haven't been reviewed by the steering committee, but it was giving a little more substance to how do you get to that goal? Is there support for any of these? So you'll see the survey showed 44% supported this housing goal. And at the open house, you see 0 put specific on that number 1 strategy, 6 on the second, 1 on the third. I'm just going to highlight more those that had at least 10 dots to it of support, and they're all up there. We haven't modified. Those exactly are the ones that were presented at the open house with the sticky dots that we're talking about here. So goal on economy and job growth had 42% support of employment and goods and services will be strategically located and connected to reduce the dependency on longer vehicle travel and to provide local and convenient options near the neighborhood. Didn't get the strong support on the strategies listed, but this meeting is something we won't refine those. I think that will be in their next rendition or following this meeting. We can give you a chance to comment to staff that will provide it to me. I think that's a good strategy of we're focusing on the land use map tonight, but just wanted to follow up where we're at in the process. Quality of life, 81% agreed with maintaining open spaces accessible to all residents for recreation and neighborhood character preservation, albeit the strategies listed here received minimal dots. So the ones bolded here are receiving more dots. So this is under sustainability goal at 80% from the survey of support, promote the use of diverse sustainable development practices, encourage the preservation of existing natural features and habitats, as well as the restoration of native plant communities. So the strategies that were bolded, and is one thing I want to bring up, anything that's bolded, is provide adequate vegetative buffers between development and natural features, and integrate environmental corridors and open spaces into a comprehensive stormwater management system that provides key ecosystem services on a regional scale where appropriate. Another sustainability goal, 77% support on the survey. Consider the historic significance of the neighborhood, especially opportunities to preserve farmland and implementation of low-impact development techniques for infrastructure design. There's two here that were bolded for strategies. Ensure the site development and infrastructure improvements occur in areas with least possible impact to natural environments. And the greatest support of all the strategies is limit development in prime agricultural areas, farmland preservation areas identified by the comp plan. There was a gentleman who spoke to some concerns of that language. I will say that in our steering committee meeting, we actually did revise that. So the orange below is actually how it was revised. Strategically preserve natural lands and existing farmland that can complement neighboring housing developments. The concern was related to going back to the comp plan of what is prime ag. So this was the general statement that was made by the steering committee, and I do apologize that wasn't what was on the board, but still had strong support for this strategy. Transportation goal, I did want to note one difference here. The survey, again, was out already before we had the steering committee meeting. So the survey version that received 30% support said support future regional transportation connections between Greenfield, the rest of Fitchburg, and surrounding communities. This could potentially include east-west connections and or establishing access to 14 via an interchange. The revised version at the open house was support future regional transportation connections that limit impacts on Greenfield's local streets as the regional and Fitchburg's neighbors continue to grow. Strategies here, the primary one that received the most support was encourage alternative north-south and east-west collector streets that shift traffic growth away from Sayin and Irish. The other transportation goal, 64%, implement safe, convenient, and attractive streets for everyone regardless of age, ability, or mode of transportation. Two strategies were of support during the open house, provide sidewalks and bike facilities if necessary along all streets to promote walkability and connectivity, and utilize traffic calming measures where appropriate to create a better street environment for pedestrians and cyclists. Want to pause there if there's any comments from the steering committee at this time. Otherwise, we can keep rolling through. All right. So updates to the land use scenario. So I just want to go back in time. So remember these bubble diagrams, there were three. One had interest without an interchange, some serious development on the north end, even neighborhood mixed use of a large area. Option B was more preferred with smaller amount of neighborhood mixed use and it did have business park. There was some interest to have jobs in this area. Refined land use, and now we're in April. You're seeing here, scenario B has that collector road shown that goes east-west north of Irish Lane. Scenario A was where the extension of Blaney didn't actually extend much to the south other than some residential development along 14. It had a little bit more density on the western end where that brown is higher density to medium-high density. Updated, just want to show the difference here from April to June, and what was presented at the open house was the additional consideration of Nobel in scenario A over to Blaney, and there was a reduction down to medium-high for all areas on that northwest quadrant there. Scenario B, you see reduction to that medium-high density in the northwest quadrant, and removal of what was the neighborhood mixed use in that pink color at Sayin and Irish. Moved that further to the east of the tracks, and moved it to medium-high density residential in place of that at that intersection. So again, what we've learned from this process: keep Greenfield green, preference for lower density residential and farming areas, preference for maintaining the current character of the neighborhood and history of Fitchburg as a farming community, concerns with current traffic and stormwater management issues. More development will increase these issues. So what have we changed, and what we'll present even in the next image here is lowered residential density, added additional open space for buffering, preservation of significant open space, included agrihood, land use category, new collector roads limited to non-residential traffic on Irish and Sayin, reducing commercial and business park area, limiting them east of the tracks, limited interventions within the existing neighborhood. So we're calling this the potential land use because the intent is we've made further revisions for discussion and then further refinement as necessary by the steering committee. So again, you will see collector A from a potential interchange. So we've kind of pushed back to say there may be an interchange. If there is one, it will be in this location where that bubble is, because there's a lot more issues further down by Byrne with wetlands and how it would connect to Collector Street going west. And so if there ever were one, it would be in this location. But we're tying Collector A more to some of the comments that we received of interest to having east-west and north-south roadways that divert from having Irish and Sayin continue to have traffic issues growing. And so that is why that's still presented, where Blaney is north-south all the way down to Byrne, and Collector A is all the way east-west, potentially further west of this neighborhood. Remove those connections to Hill Street, and I'm blanking on the name on the corner here. Down here, that was removed. That connection was too wet, as noted by others. There was a lot of concern about connecting Hill, and so we are showing trail connections that get back into the neighborhood, but not a road. However, we are showing Old Indian that does have a stubbed section to the end of what is developed, connecting in, but not all the way to Kane. Also changed, you see Collector B, that north-south that runs through the western half all the way potentially down to Byrne Road. So the idea is if we're not connecting significantly into the neighborhood, we want to think about how it impacts the Kane and to these other developments, that there is another reliever road through that development. Also notable change, if you go back, is you're not seeing any of that brown. There's only one location of the brown, and that is east of the tracks close to the potential interchange. Otherwise, everything is shown medium density in the orange, or the yellow, which is the low density. Agrihood or farming preservation is in this color, this tan color, and it's hatched in this section. Hatching means at this time, if it were to move forward, it could be either it's let the market dictate and the landowners dictate what that happens within those two options. Similar, you see that along Blaney, where you're seeing the higher density or business park at what is Blaney and Collector A roundabout, and you're seeing medium high with that business park to the south. Business park is likely not happening here 100% if that road doesn't connect through, or potentially an interchange. But there is potential to see some residential along that corridor. So that covers the basis. We are showing maybe there should be continuation of roads west of Kane. That's not part of this plan. You see hatching to the north. That is the adopted McGaw neighborhood plan, where you see Nobel continuing through over to Blaney. Likely, potentially, you wouldn't have both of those east-west. There's a lot of issues with one to the north. Again, we talked about if you add another track crossing, railroad track crossing, you might have to lose a different one. So having two additional likely is not possible. You could bridge it. That's very expensive. But so we're showing what was in the McGaw plan, but we think the Collector A, if there is development north of Irish, is important to this plan based on some of the feedback and just thinking through best practices. So again, just actually in a graph form, you're seeing from the refined land use to the updated land use to the potential scenario, kind of how each element has gone up, down, or question mark. You see those hatch lines are the variability of flex areas that could be business park or could be residential. So that's why we're showing some that say 17 and 19% or 4 to 14%. So potentially something changes tonight that takes it down just to, for instance, 4% of business park. And that would suggest it's going down from our plans. Already showing commercial and neighborhood mixed use goes down. There's a question mark on the medium high density. You see low density has increased. Aggregate has come down. There's been some question on that, thought of that design and how it impacts with farm equipment within a neighborhood, and we'll talk about that piece as well. And then open space has increased. We just want to touch on development process. What is this plan really doing here? And even talking about, I do urban design work, and for development, things we look at is what is the landowner's interest in development, what's their outcome they're looking for, what is allowed by the comp plan, future land use map, or the corp related to park needs. Does it need a community park? Has it been earmarked for that? Other city documents. Then how will it be regulated? By zoning, land division, official map. How will water be managed on the site? I've learned as a designer, water leads everything. You got to figure out how you can treat the water as a key part of your initial design. Are there features and required or desired to be protected? Wetlands, woodlands, and then are there roads and trails that you should connect to into the development? The review process typically is meeting with staff. Is it already in the urban service area? If not, you need to do an amendment. Is it already within the city boundary? If not, you need an annexation. And then you talk about the land use plan with Plan Commission. You get a recommendation on the plat or CSM and rezoning, which has a public hearing, so the public would be involved in that. Then council approval. Then they're submitting engineering plans, review by staff, then getting the permits by the city, by DNR, by the state, and then the developer builds the roads, installs the utilities, and grades the lots. I want to key on that is when we talk about what we're showing in the land use scenario and when the future land use map, is roads are built by developers. When you come in with a desire of development on the land, they might require you to reserve right-of-way, and that's the purpose of saying these collector roads are key roads that we want to see through the land. It could maneuver north and south within that development, but it needs to connect A to B on the edges of your development. So just again, what is a land use scenario, what it is, a long-term vision, what's allowable, supports identifying the character and design parameters within the neighborhood, and identifying infrastructure needs. What it's not is suggesting property shall be redeveloped or be sold for development, restricting landowners from using their property as they're currently using it, and limiting farming or adding barriers to their current operation. Again, part of this reason we're doing this process is you see this future land use map in the city, clearly denoting preferred land uses in what is the developed area within the urban service area. The cross-hatching you're seeing are these FUDAs, and this is one of those neighborhoods that we're looking at that wasn't predetermined what the land use would be. That's why we're doing this process. So, based on the potential land use, this is an example of what that future land use map would be amended into the comp plan. So you see that collector A, collector B, Whalen extension, Old Indian extension, and Blaney roads are what you see as roads that are determined that that right-of-way should be dedicated if development is proposed and should be developed by the developer when that development happens. The other roads we're showing on these concepts are getting to the character of the neighborhood, what housing types we're talking about. It's more about looking at infrastructure needs based on that, but ultimately this is the policy map. I'm getting tired of speaking, so I know everyone else is, so I'm just trying to get to where we were and where we're going. So we started this in November 23. We had some slowdowns as we went through when we talked to the public and to the steering committee. So you see revisions of April and June. August, we had the online survey and open house. So we've talked to developers about the concepts. We talked to property owners. We've talked to certain entities, school district, CARPC. We just recently talked to Friends of the Webisa wetlands. Just noting here where we're going, crossouts of where we had originally scoped was to be done in November of this year. We're 4 months behind that, And this is kind of laying out, if we can move forward tonight, that we're looking at potentially getting to March, potential of consideration of approval. And the consideration of a early December meeting, potentially, we'll talk about a date for our next meeting. So, pause. Yes.
I just have a question. It was a few slides back, so my apologies. Can you hear me okay, Jeremy? Yeah? Okay, great. I'll speak up. So I just kind of want to understand a definition when we say, which I think is very effective, the slogan of Keep Greenfield Green. I just want to define what that means, because if we're talking about, it could mean a couple things. It could mean if you want to keep a lot more mass of greenland, you would develop on less of it with higher density. Or I just want to understand how we're defining the Keep Greenfield Green, because it's a great takeaway and a great slogan, but I want to make sure we're all defining it the same way. How did you interpret that?
I interpreted the interest that a good portion of the land remains preserved as open space. That's how I took it. We can have comment from the public later on that, but that's how I took it. I don't know if anyone else who's been at these meetings on the committee wants to speak to what they heard, any different than that.
I just wanted to say that I do think there's different definitions going on. There's competing definitions going on. And there is a group within Greenfield. Okay, absolutely. Thank you. There is a group, and we've heard this at the public listening sessions, and I've attended all the steering committee meetings and all of the public listening sessions, and there is a definite group that feels that Keep Greenfield Green means really only low density or no development. So I think, there are competing definitions going on. A follow-up question I wanted to ask after hers is, you have these collector roads and so forth. You have them going through areas where there's multiple owners, and not just like a couple, but like, 5 owners or whatever on Collector B. I know that I had asked Brad Sipple about, when does the road go in? I mean, and he seemed to indicate that it would go in as far as the development would go in, right? And is that practical? So do you want to dance? I just trying to understand this, because this was the road situation has been one of the most contentious issues, both at the last steering committee meeting and also at the last public listening session. So if after you answer her, can you answer me about this development of the roads? Thank you.
Well, I don't know if any follow-up is needed. Sure, I heard about wanting low density and no development. I guess I followed your two terminology. I definitely heard what you heard, Elizabeth, but for the Greenfield Green, I think it's the case of it could be more densely populated to save more area for development, or it could be low density. To me, it gets to the heart of just keeping a lot as open space as much as possible.
I think that kind of answers my question. There's two definitions. One is, if we've decided to interpret it as kind of keeping the character and the green spaces, because technically by numbers, if you had higher density, you could do it in fewer places and therefore have more green space, right? It's just math and numbers. But we're saying, actually, the general intention that we heard from folks was the opposite of keep the character of the Greenfield neighborhood, and that's what's been taken as the interpretation here.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I think that makes sense with everything you've shown here.
Sure. And I think the city can reply to this, your question, Elizabeth, but I'll reinforce, because I do, on both sides, I review and I do development, is that's what's required. It's incremental based on the development that goes in.
Just go ahead.
What's that?
Continue.
Okay. So that is how it has been done in every community that I know. That's what's required, unless the community itself elects to finish a road on their own. But typically through development, it's just through the development piece that gets built. And so at some point it's contiguous, but not always. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was a little bit distracted, but let me talk about a little bit more detail about how our development process, when a project comes through, we meet with a developer who already has a landowner who's willing to develop, right? So the city does not put in roads, we do not take right-of-way. When a development is coming forward, there's already a willing landowner and also a developer. Sometimes it's one and the same. And Brad and I look to our comp plan and our neighborhood plans to say, this is the land use for this area of land, for this particular place, and the roadways. We do, and that developer would have to put in those roadways through their property, but I cannot make them put roads in the neighbor's property. Does that make sense? So there'll be a temporary stub on that road for an indefinite time period until the next landowner is ready to develop. Does that make sense?
Okay, so to clarify, let's say you had a number of landowners, though, and one of the landlocked landowners wanted to sell and develop, and the others didn't, but how are you going to get in and out for the person that wants to develop versus the ones surrounding that don't?
Yeah, that's very good. It won't happen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Due to the noise, which we are all well aware of, our FACTv team has invited us to move over to the council chambers. That would be in the next building and in council's chambers. So we will regroup in about 10 minutes or so and pick up right where we left off. So thank you for the move. What's that? Okay. Good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and restart our meeting in a little bit quieter room. Unfortunately, this room was occupied a little bit earlier this evening, so we were fortunate that the previous meeting was able to wrap up quicker than expected. We did not expect quite the loud noise, but really important event for the city with the Senior Center celebrating National Senior Center Day. So it's an important event. I'm glad that we could find our way to a little bit more quiet room for us. And so once again, what we'll do this evening, we're going into discussions with the steering committee. After that, we will take public comments. I do need to have your half sheets if you would like to speak. I've asked the steering committee to just kick off our next section of the meeting with a brief introduction and just let us know your name. So if we could just start.
Representing Frostwood Farms.
I'm Mary Sue Opperman, Stoneman Farm.
Elizabeth Thompson, guys next door, you know me.
Nicole Vaffadari, Alder for District 4.
Jason Valerius, Executive Director of the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission. I'll note that I'm present here at the invitation of the city for a couple of reasons. One, to kind of represent a regional perspective related to development, but also because we are kind of piloting a new approach to how we think about expansions to the urban service area and trying to be involved a little earlier than when developers show up at the table.
Ed Kinney, I'm on Wayland Road. Prior to that, I lived on the end of the cul-de-sac in East Hill. Grew up in the neighborhood. I was on Plan Commission for 30 years as well.
And I realize I probably should introduce myself. I am Deanna Schmidt. I am the city planner and zoning administrator here at the city of Fitchburg.
Brad Sipple, community development planner for the city of Fitchburg.
And I'm Steve Trumlett with MSA, urban designer. Oh, go ahead.
And I'm Vanessa, assistant planner at MSA as well.
So I think we can go back to if there's any general questions from the committee before we get into those questions that were in the memo. Yes, Jason.
My question is about water. You mentioned how typical it is to be evaluating where the water comes from, where it goes. There are quite a few comments about groundwater and about seepage into basements, which we see from time to time, but a little less common and a little harder to evaluate. Is there more that you can tell us about what we know about that issue?
I do not know currently. The engineering aspect of our process was intended to be after we looked at general land use and road connectivity. We definitely did hear those comments throughout this process. Generally speaking, with stormwater management, it needs to be pre-development conditions is already kind of the starting point. And will the aspects that you're speaking about and all our engineering related to traffic, also we're going to be looking at utility extensions. That's all going to be the next part of this process.
Got a couple of questions going back to road connections. So I think I understand the idea here is that the small section of Irish Lane would not be vacated unless Collector A was built to requiring, essentially creating the issue with the railroad of another crossing.
Okay.
So I think that's important that everyone understands that. But the other question that I've got is, if Nobel came through, what railroad connection would need to be potentially given up to allow for that? What crossing?
Assuming Collector A has been built?
Yeah. Or is it kind of, one or the other? Maybe there's A or maybe there's Nobel.
That's potentially, because it's in the McGaw plan, a consideration. I will say impacts to the current wetlands, which isn't shown up on this exact map, are more problematic with Nobel extending across than Collector Road A. And so if you're just looking at low impact, Collector A is the better option. And if you were to put in both at any point that made sense, it's likely the best option may have to be bridging wetlands or crossing. But that's for future conversations with the railroad too. We're making some assumptions based on what has been track record thus far. It doesn't preclude to start the conversation about adding it entirely.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, steering committee?
I just want to echo the comment in question that Jason asked regarding stormwater runoff. I think it's a valid concern that I've heard from constituents. And I just want to make sure that that is a top priority. And to your point, it is a requirement that no development can happen with and make the flooding conditions worse. So I think we should continue to have that conversation, because I know there are some constituents that feel like status quo isn't good enough either, which I know is not something we can ask developers to pay for. We can't ask them, or we can't encourage them, I guess, to make it better than it was before they came. But I guess just kind of thinking out loud, that is a concern that I feel like is very reasonable and understandable from a lot of constituents I've spoken with.
And the city staff can delve into it too a little bit, but it's not currently in the urban service area. There could be certain restrictions added that does go beyond current requirements, and that could be a potential recommendation in the plan if you want to so put it in there that improves it beyond what is typically required. Obviously, that impacts cost and what can be developed, and that may impact what the product is. But that's something to consider if that is a concern.
When in the process do we have to consider that? Because I think it would be really nice to entertain or at least understand like where in parts of the neighborhood is flooding worse, or are there like persistent issues, and then could we say, okay, in this area it does have to be improved, and what does that cost, right? Is it, okay, it adds $50,000 worth of cost at that point, like absolutely, let's put it in there. If it adds, $5 million of cost, okay, that might be a different consideration.
Yeah, so part of the process when you get into the engineering, it's a modeling game. So it goes into the computer and it spits out where it assumes flooding issues, but if there's existing known that's beyond the model that we can hear from others, that could be noted. I know there has been, let's see if we can mouse, study and concerns of what's been happening in this region. As you can see, we definitely looked at consideration of where open space is relative to these areas with that consideration. And again, that will come further once we get into the modeling process of that. Okay. Well, as we go, you can add more questions. Again, the questions that were in the memo and are going to be presented on the screen are just starting conversations. If you have additional questions or considerations that we should be going forward, this would be a great time to do so. I should also note, I touched on that some trails have been shown connecting where roads were previously. That is an add to what you've seen recently, and what was not at the open house is those red lines are potential off-street trail connections. So there obviously would be routing that would happen on existing streets that are, if you have low traffic and good visibility, that's still sustainable for biking safely. But this red dash lines are presenting where you could have more of a regional trail routing that's off-road or adjacent to road. So you'll see that along Blaney all the way through. You'll see that along the southern edge through the open space next to wetlands. There is a cut through that's shown more accurately in the concept that runs between Collector B and Kane, running north, that connects back to Collector B. Noted that connection over to Hill, continues north to Irish, and there's routing along Irish. You'll see a swath of green. It might be difficult to see along Irish that is setting back development by at least 50 feet that has that corridor, and it connects north along Collector A. Since that wasn't discussed before, any comments specifically on that element?
Yes. Do you need the permission of the landowners for these paths? Because that has come up before in my discussions with the landowners. They're not great on roads and not necessarily supportive of paths running through their property.
Go ahead. I'll let you speak to that one.
It does require the approval and approval of the landowners. Yes, I mean these are, everything you see on this map does not happen unless there is a developer and a willing landowner, right? And a landowner who's willing to sell. As I mentioned, we begin with an interested developer and an interested landowner. That's where this process, and we do not require things on other people's property.
Again, there will be an opportunity after this meeting if you have additional comments when you get to look at it in further detail. Jason, were you going to have a comment?
Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There we go, sorry. I guess I'm a little bit concerned because in this concept, there's a heavy emphasis on business park and potential business park. And this is something that sort of came out on their survey where there was a feeling kind of there's too much business park. And I know, and I've discussed this with staff a little bit, I know that the Jones Farm, you've got the latter half of it kind of back along that road, in there. You've got that now under potential future development, when in concept day, I mean, it was all not prime farmland, but preserved farmland, and as well for the Giles property underneath. And I just want to say that for two reasons. One, it was pointed out to us earlier in the meeting that there was a top priority or very high priority of the residents for farmland preservation. And two, I just feel like when this first came out in April and I saw this, and it just felt like it was really kind of, as far as business park, that it was more like kind of the wish of the city staff. And I do like Mike Zimmerman and Joyce Wright. I mean, Joyce asked the tough questions. I really appreciate that of her. But it's not going to necessarily solve the current situation of not really having a really decent business park of the size that they desire now. I mean, really, I talked with Deanna about this, really, they should be going to council and saying, if you got $1 million for portable housing, why not think about $1 million for a decent business park? Because this is like way, way, way out in the future, and it's not necessarily a really good business strategy. So I personally would like to see south of Irish Lane, I'd like to see the business part go away and the density to be reconsidered. Thank you.
So you're hitting on the actual question that's on the slide. So that was in the memo, and so we can continue with that unless, Jason, you have a different comment? Okay. Okay.
So you want to talk about that?
Sure, let's talk about it.
I think, so the question is, what do we think about that? Those options, the uses. As residential, it doesn't make a ton of sense to me in that it is kind of isolated from the rest of the neighborhood. It's hard to connect. It's right next to the highway. It becomes isolated, kind of off by itself. As business park, it makes a little bit more sense. Though when I look at the topography, I worry about how it works with the topography because it's quite sloped through there, and I don't know how conducive it is. I mean, it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about office space, sure, but that's not really where the market is that we see right now. So I'm kind of, I don't know that I'm helping. I'm identifying problems with both options down there, but I think if it's business park, the other, if it works with the land, I wonder if you actually would have to connect that road all the way through, and if you had one user back there that you just have, if you could get away with one access point instead of having to connect that all the way through down to Byrne.
I'll comment on that and I'll open it up again is we looked at continuing down Blaney from the north. You see a big portion that is green beyond south of Irish, and that's due to wetlands and stormwater management we talked about. So the extension of that road, there's a lot of cost just to get it down to those lands. Now, could you come up from Blaney? But again, you're very cut off. Some of what we're seeing to the north is kind of carrying through what's happening south of Lacey. There is business park being developed currently now, and this is just connected to that. So north of that's easiest connection, but any kind of development of connecting all the way down to Blaney, there is a gap here that is just a cost. But again, the idea there, based on feedback even, is it would definitely support reduction of long-term impacts to Sayin if that was connected. So you would need, if it's residential, enough density to warrant making that road connection that has no development along it. And I think if you have enough density and you have the connection through trails, I don't think it's as removed as you're suggesting as this develops even on the east side of the interstate.
If I could just briefly add on to that, I guess I'd say if it were residential, and there's quite a bit of, what would you say the acreage is there? Do we have that
I think
labeled?
it's at least 50.
Yeah, so there's enough acreage there that that could be sort of a relatively complete neighborhood unto itself. There's a lot of land there, and so being specific about that expectation would be good.
Could I ask a question? Maybe this is not traditional, but you mentioned, Jason, if it's business park, great, but that's not what you're seeing out in market. What are you seeing out in market?
Well, what I was saying is if it's office,
yes,
that can deal with the contours, not a big deal. But when we say business park, often today we're talking about users that want a bunch of flat land to spread out horizontally, and that's not what this is.
Yeah, and Jason, I would concur with you, Jason, about that, because if you look at Verona and the construction of Arrowhead, which is an absolutely huge campus, you need a lot of land. It needs to be flat. You don't want it causing issues with stormwater runoff, or even in the case of a business park. I've been asked, and I know that the city staff has sort of reassured me, there won't be dealing with chemicals, but the water will be city, and everything will be in its own sort of closed system. But we have heard about spills, and we have heard about weird things happening, something blowing up or gas line or whatever, and then suddenly you have contamination. And I do think that it's a little bit close to where there is settlement. That I'd like to see this business park somewhere else on flatter land, more contained, and just an environment where it's conducive to have it. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm not so worried about contamination, and I think that can happen literally anywhere. I do think the point that was made about this potentially being a neighborhood or high density. Is this high density or high medium?
It's medium high, up to 20 units per acre.
Thank you. Medium high. On the flip side, I like it being business more than residential just due to the proximity of the highway. But I guess my question is how good is the farmland here? Are we paving over really fertile ground when we think about, I know different parts of the city have different qualities of farmable land, and I'd just like to understand what this parcel specifically is kind of rated as.
Sure. It's currently being farmed, so there's productivity in that sense. And the city can speak to this, but the reason this neighborhood was selected is the prime ag that exists further west of here. So if you're looking at the highest quality black dirt, it's west of this neighborhood. But as noted, it is currently being farmed. So there is a use that is taking advantage of what is there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Nicole, just at our last steering committee meeting, that was a point of contention that rating farmland and saying, oh, the West is so great and ours is, not so great. Somebody that was on one of the farming properties really come and talk to us, and they objected to that. They felt that was a little bit insulting, and they felt that farmland preservation is farmland preservation, and it's not about, how your soil is rated and so forth. It's that you're farming, and this was somebody coming off one of the farms that had farmed for generations. So I'm not trying to cut you down for asking that question, but I just want to. It was said on the slide that Steve showed us earlier tonight that statement had been revised. Correct, Steve, about what is prime farmland versus just farmland?
Correct.
Okay,
and I'll keep going back to that. This is not implying anyone is going to develop. It's up to the landowner to ultimately develop. So this plan is in place for those that determine they want to sell or develop their land, and this gives a direction on use. So this is not saying it can't be long-term staying in ag.
Yeah, and just to clarify that, I appreciate that, and I think that's really fair, because I think if I was a farmer, I would take my farm very personally and have the highest pride. The reason I bring it up is I did hear from a couple constituents the argument that like we need to protect our farmland for our ability to produce crop. So if I hear it from constituents as a concern, I feel like it's my job as a representative to ask specifically about it. But I agree. I would take that very personally if I was a farmer, because I'd be very proud of my farmland.
Could I ask a related question that was can come up in the feedback? Could we get a definition of what's considered an abandoned property and how that comes to be reappropriated by the city or somebody else? Because I think we've driven by parcels of land that kind of look neglected and so forth, and they're just concerned about what happens with that because we don't have any knowledge here.
Okay. So the city isn't in the city doesn't take over parcels or property that are abandoned. Usually there is some owner. There is a mechanism for the county, for Dane County, if taxes are unpaid, there is a mechanism for the county to take legal title of those properties, but the city doesn't take over abandoned properties. We don't have the resources or the legal ability to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
I do want to add a little more color on Jason's comments about heights, because we don't have that on here, the contours. I had Vanessa look it up just for everyone's understanding. Is the northern, is it still showing my mouse? It's not. There we go. This line, there's a line here of a property. This portion actually is not significantly contoured. The portion that is south of this line through this portion is. And there's a knob here that we clearly have said is preserved. But just noting that there is plausibility of this land for business park, a little more difficult as you go south of this line, if it weren't office.
So I work up on Highway 19 between the interstate and Highway 51. Right across from where Quick Trip is putting in their project, which is like, I don't know, 60 acres or something like. It's an enormous amount of land. And there were hills in there, and we have watched them basically level the entire thing. You know, you take off the hill and you fill somewhere else. It's doable if that's what you need to do. You know, over the long term, when we worked through the comprehensive plan, we envisioned development occurring in Fitchburg along these corridors, along Highway 14 and MM and the rail corridor. Clearly this is up to the landowner as to whether they ever want to do anything for it. But from a planning standpoint, that's not where I would plan long-term agricultural preservation. You're between the railroad track and you're between Highway 14. I think it's logical for a business use. Whether it works as residential, I don't know. It kind of depends on what's happening with the railroad at that time, how busy and active the railroad is. But certainly Highway 14 is going to remain very busy and active. So whether that's attractive for residential, I don't know. I like the idea of leaving it open for future determination. But I do think that the logical thing long term is that, you know, property in that area between the railroad and Highway 14 would likely be developed at some point.
I would agree with that, but then also still point out that if you end up with a mix and some residential, I would want to be sure that there's enough residential that it makes sense and you don't have this isolated little bit of residential. So something to assure that would be good.
So I'm hearing a few saying the idea of leaving the flexibility but have more stronger policy on the level of residential needs to be substantial enough to have a balanced neighborhood in itself, so it's not isolated. Any other comments or suggestions another way? This is definitely a time that I'd want to make sure we have a direction. Not saying this is final, but this is definitely what we're bringing towards our engineers to start evaluating utilities, transportation, and stormwater.
Do we have an idea what the landowner would want that to look like if he were to sell?
So,
just like as a farmer, what they would envision that land looking like?
Landowner noted his restrictions on the land for development for his generation and the next, likely, unless there's a modification to it. So intentions is not to see development there at this time, but things can change. Believe the statement was, if it were developed, that interesting agribusiness potentially, but was seeing low density residential. But I noted the concern of the reality of if this road connection goes through, if that's going to pencil out for any developer of that land, to have that road connection through lands that would not have development. And he could not develop on his own without a road connection. So it has to come from one way or the other.
And I'll just add that part of the concern of, like, if we were to identify that as low density, but then it's not financially feasible to do so, they'd end up coming to us for an amendment to the comp plan anyway, and it's outside of this whole neighborhood planning process then. So it's better for us to try to plan for something that is feasible for a developer to put in the long term too.
Brad, I had a question on that. So what we've been telling people is that the colors on these maps and the densities is the maximum amount that people can develop. But you're saying, it almost sounded to me like the city is going to tell the owner and the prospective developer that they have to develop at a certain density. Like, okay, just want to make sure about that.
Yeah, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
The land use categories do have a range. So I think the medium high it's capped at 20. I don't remember what it starts.
It's capped at 20. 9
yeah.
to 20.
So that's a 9 to 20 in there. So that's basically the range of densities that would be allowable under that land use category. My point is that for somebody who wanted, like, if that property owner decided they wanted to develop and approached a developer or a developer approached them, that it probably just wouldn't work, like pencil out for low density residential, and they'd have to find another way to make it pencil out. So I'm not saying that we would.
I think your point too, Brad, that's important is that through this process, the entire there's a hearing process for the neighborhood, for all of us to come together and say what works for us. For comp plans or amendments, there's not entire committees convened, right? It follows its normal process. It goes through plan, it goes through any other committees that need to be convened, and then your elected alders vote on it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important point, that if we make this unreasonable in the terms of that a developer couldn't feasibly make a project fiscally make sense, then they're just going to come back to council and ask for an amendment, and there's going to be a lot less input there.
Yeah.
Whereas this process, even though as painful as it feels sometimes, or, like, disagreement is healthy and good, but it's not always fun, like, it's a lot more community input than the other route.
Yeah.
And the general practice has been in this, let's say all the area there that is in this brown was developed. If there's sections of it could be lower than 9, if generally speaking the entire bubble gets in that range. So there could be sections of this that you could see below that 9 units per acre, but it's generally used, and can verify with staff, that's what I've heard, is it's generally speaking of the entire development or larger area.
Yeah, we would calculate those numbers and look at those density ranges over the entire development area. And so at a staff level and consistent with our comprehensive plan, we encourage a mix of housing. So when you do see the brown color on there, once a project comes forward, generally there is a wider range of different types of housing that you will see. So there might be a little bit larger lots, maybe some smaller lots to get to us to that kind of general development range.
So at this time, are we moving forward as it's presented with consideration of a policy that it is a substantial neighborhood if it were to be developed there? Okay. Now let's talk about north of Irish in the same east of the tracks. You'll see that there is, again, business park. There's the higher density residential, which is that darker brown, or it could be business park. On a future slide, we ask about, I believe, the neighborhood mixed use, but that's what that pink, reddish pink color is on the southwest corner of that roundabout. That could be medium density residential or mixed use. And I'll repeat again, mixed use in this form is not saying only vertical mixed use, meaning commercial on the first floor, residential above. It could be purely residential building. It could be purely a commercial building. It could be that vertical mixed use, or it could be a blend. So that one already by itself is very flexible. We're adding the flexibility that could be down all the way to medium density, so all the way down to 5 units per acre. So there's two parts. One is the business park piece. Let's start there. Again, this is a nexus of what's developing north of what we're seeing here on Blaney. There is pockets of business park that's being extended south of Lacey. So that's the nexus without even an interchange.
I like the idea of keeping it flexible because we really don't know what's going to happen with the road connections down the road. And there are so many dynamics here that it's difficult to envision because you don't know the timing on any of this or even whether some of these parcels will ever develop. So in that respect, I do like the flexibility that's shown here in the plan.
I had a question on the business park north portion of that, whether it gives the family the flexibility if they want to go and sell residential, that they have that option to do so. Because I do think it's their land, and I don't want them held up because, they've got something against business park. If they want to sell and they want to sell for residential, I mean, ultimately, my view is that it's kind of, their land. And so I don't want them locked into business. That could be, medium residential. But I'm just putting that out there so that they have more flexibility to potentially let go.
Could you just circle on the map where all the apartments are going in right now in that area? Is that on the purple, or is that?
You're talking off of Lacey?
Yeah, along
along
Blaney Road, too.
Yeah. What's that?
I mean, isn't it along Blaney, all the apartments that are going up?
Actually, it's quite a ways to the north,
Is it
not
farther north?
on this particular map.
All right, I get confused.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
Okay.
It's actually quite a ways to the north there.
Okay.
I would agree with that comment. In terms of having it mixed, that opportunity to carry that, if you already have residential and mixed above, the ability to carry that all the way through. It could be both, or it could be a choice of either one. That way it's not, I think that comment was it's not locked kind of in the middle. That way right now you have an industrial park that's locked in the middle of some mixed density or the residential on both sides of it. Just a thought.
Well, directly to the north here across the wetlands, what is already approved, even in the zoning, is slightly to the west, some apartments, some multifamily housing, and then directly to the north as Blaney Road would continue. To the east of that is Business Park already. So we do have approved Business Park there.
So you're saying, is that to replace the granary, Deanna, when they decide to go?
Eventually, when they do go, that hasn't been finalized in the zoning yet. Right now, still on the future land use map, it's identified as transit-orientated development and perhaps a station kind of area for a potential, if the rail line ever did come through. That's what the current future land use map is. At this point, Hardtongue doesn't have any plans to decommission their facilities and redevelop, but they do have plans to directly to the east and north of their plant to develop Business Park.
So yeah, I'm hearing extending that flexibility to the Business Park section that's north of, what is it, power lines. That's where you see that green gap there. Right now we have high density shown along Collector A and Blaney. There was a comment by Elizabeth about it being medium density for this northern one. Would like to hear people's opinion of that drop down, if it should be medium high, if anything, or medium makes sense as that. If you think about intensity of Business Park as the option versus what residential, I think you are looking more at that medium high is more of the same blend. But I could be supportive of the more flexibility is good. But what kind of direction would you like to see of what density of residential?
Is there a, I have a question and then an opinion comment. What is the downside of making that flexible? Like, is there a downside of making it flexible?
I would say Jason hit the biggest part of it is if one portion of the land or one landowner chooses, I want to develop that as residential, and the next property owner wants it to be Business Park, you're creating these isolated uses. I would say, the smart code that you have in place is that mindset that land uses can be blended if they're designed properly, but that's not always the case, and it's not always directed to smart code. So that's the only negative direction, and it could impact our assumptions on utilities too, because a business park potentially could have a lot of storage area, not a lot of bathrooms for a lot of staff versus the amount that you could have in residential. We would always assume worst case scenario in that scenario. So that's not a big thing. We would always assume the worst case. So it's more about character and the land use divisions.
And connectivity of the neighborhood and the business park. I think that's the other piece that can and Steve kind of touched on this, but it can get broken up if it's all up to the property owners.
Gotcha.
On what exactly goes in there.
Which does make sense to Jason's earlier comment about like not wanting neighborhoods to feel like they're on an island. If we look at mixed use, I guess then my question on your previous comment of like the bathroom example, right? If you had a business park, it's fewer restrooms. If you have high density, it's probably the highest amount of restroom usage. So if you're blending it, does that cause issue? Like, does medium high density / business park make more sense than high density business park, or is it just kind of a negligible difference? And maybe I'm focusing too much on bathrooms. I might be focusing too much on bathrooms. If you're like, let it go, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think you if you're going to have flexibility, you want to always consider the worst case scenario and be able to serve that. I don't think that should be a reason to preclude what makes sense by the land use and density aspect. And so I would think about if we are having high density as an option, we're at the northeast corner of that roundabout, blending it down, jumping right to medium, to me, doesn't seem like the right transition.
And I would, just to kind of weigh in on an opinion, I agree. This is the only place on this map that has high density at all, unless I'm not tracking colors. And if there is an interchange, which I agree with the statement, like there are so many things that have to happen. I'm glad we removed that from here. I appreciate you listening to constituents too and saying like, hey, it could happen here, but we don't know. I would say I'm in favor of like having one spot on here that's high or medium high density. I think a jump to medium density is too low for this location because it seems still within the spirit. It's not interrupting any additional characteristics of the land, in my opinion, and I think having one spot for high density is reasonable. But I like the mixed use of leaving it flexible so the landowner isn't constricted to only being able to sell that to business park if he or she can't.
If it went to medium high, I guess I'd be okay with that because that has an upper limit. The high density right now does not have an upper limit. I guess, and if we're going to talk about bathrooms, we should mention that the septic interceptor is going to go in there someplace. So might be useful to have higher density there. I'm not sure. I just want to make sure that there's not going to be too much traffic coming off of this. That's going to, when it's in the beginning stages, you've got collector A there, but the most, if the Stoneman Farm with the Operant family is not developed, then that's going to go, the traffic from there is going to go to one of two places, I guess. It's going to go to Syene, and then there's going to be, I guess, it looks like it's going to go off on one direction. So I guess that roundabout will have to be built when that particular development happens. In order to connect that neighborhood or whatever is developed there, it will have to have that roundabout so that people can get out and go either east or west. So, but my thought is medium high, maybe on that, and again, might want to consider on the purple part, might want to consider that potentially residential as well as an option, because I think honestly the Haas family will come to their own decision. I don't want to necessarily see them, feel like they have to have it developed as business park. That the purple portion, yeah. That if you give people options, they may be more willing to let go.
So I think I've heard loud and clear that sounds like there's direction of the northern, just purple right now would become purple and medium high flex. Now, you're suggesting, I think, Elizabeth, that also downgrading the existing high density that's south of there. And so I'd like to hear from others about if that one portion stays high density or it goes down to medium high.
I would support keeping the flexibility that you are showing right now for the high density.
I think if there has to be high density, that's the best place for it. It's not something I want. I think we have way too many apartments in Fitchburg, but if there's going to be high density, that seems to be a good spot for it.
North of what's designated in purple, are those coming in under smart code?
They are not.
They are not.
They're
Okay, so
standard zoning.
there's no real opportunity to extend smart code into this area.
Oh, I wouldn't say that at all. As part of our contract with Steve and his team, we will look at the potential of smart code also.
Could you describe and define smart code for those of us who might not be as familiar with smart code?
Sure. So the city of Fitchburg has, I really think of it as two different zoning codes, actually. We have our more traditional zoning code that is focused on the uses of land that says, here goes residential, here goes business, here goes highway business. It's very separated. In smart code, the focus is less on the particular types of uses, but more on the form and the shape of the building. So we have actually 3 smart code neighborhoods. Our largest and most built out is Terra Vesa, which is of course on Lacey on the east side of 14. And then our second one is Nine Springs, which is on the west side of Lacey. And our third one is the Addison Apartments. We call it North Park, but that is our third smart code community.
So if smart code is working for us at the time when this potentially comes in, I don't want to preclude this coming in under smart code. So if we designate it as mixed use or at least flexible as to what it might be in the future, I think that's good.
So as Deanna mentioned, so there will be two separate maps ultimately in the finished product. We presented what the future land use, which is related to using conventional zoning. There will be a regulating plan, or Article 3, I think you call it here, that would show transects. And so that would be the second version if it were to go to smart code. So there would be some direction on that.
The option would be there if the developer and landowner so chose to go that direction.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So again, we're back to, I think I heard a couple of direction of keep that high density there, medium high north of there, business park as an option for those areas. Elizabeth suggested slightly lighter for the high density. Is there any additional comments on that? Then I guess based on comments, I say the majority suggested keep that high density at this time. For that one spot, and to the north, it will include medium high. Okay. So we didn't focus on it, but is there any conversation about the neighborhood mixed use in the red with the orange medium density in the southwest corner of that roundabout?
It's good.
Okay. So the last one is, we brought in that idea of this agri-hood. And again, to remind you, that is the intent of, I'm sure some have heard of conservation subdivision, where you are clustering development to preserve the majority of the land. The same idea has been done across the nation, locally in Middleton and in Madison, where you do it based around ag and farming. And that could be still separate from not being specifically to the neighborhood, and it just exists and preserved, or it's actually part of that neighborhood as a focus. So we see two areas here still remaining in that form. It is portion of the Jones farm there in that has just shown that as the long term potentially. It's on the edge of what is being proposed as future development. So, if you're thinking about concerns of farm equipment on the roads and such, it's less impactful than if we're looking at the area that's more central, if it were to build out, as we're showing, west of the existing neighborhood, where local roads would see farm equipment. And so that's been kind of some discussions with staff of, does it make sense to show that as still a long-term result of that area if it were to develop versus just low-density residential? So we can keep the flexibility there, or show that all as low-density residential, or any revision that you see is a good direction.
I would keep the flexibility to, definitely allow time to determine what an agri-hood is really going to look like. I mean, I think that's part of the question. I think it would be unreasonable to expect that you're going to be getting big equipment in there, combines, that you're going to be, this is not going to be corn and beans long term. This is going to be something else. But what is that going to be? We don't know. But I like the flexibility of leaving it in there as an option.
Is that part, because I think I was having the same thing of like, I would love to leave that in there, and like how big of the farm equipment are we talking? Like, is there any restriction or any basis on that to say, could someone get a huge combine in there? Could they plant things that would require a lot of large farm equipment?
I think it's doubtful, but I would say that I'm not the right person to answer that. I think we came to the idea of the concept and how we can preserve farmland and be a nucleus of this neighborhood. There are factors like that, as well as understanding for landowners that come in, if they build these clusters, that there is going to be odor, there's going to be noise, and other things that you would have to have in place, or restrictions and understanding. So there's a lot of things to work out. I have not been involved in one of those developments.
There's one house really close to that collector B. Is that on the east or the west side of that house, on that collector B? Right there. I can't tell with the map exactly.
Just going to bring them back, sustain real quick. It's kind of splits two existing homes. Right now there's a current private drive that comes to a V, if you can remember what that looks like. And this would go basically just at that V, basically. So there's probably a 100 to 200 spacing, depending which direction you're going.
So the house
from the house from the road.
The house is on the east of it or the west of it?
There's the main house that's by itself is east of it by probably a couple 100 feet.
Okay. So as that lays out, it just feels like the reality of how that lays out in the proximity of, because I think that's the only house in that whole defined area, correct?
I believe there's two.
Oh, is there two? Okay. My recommendation or my opinion would be is just how that lays out to be strategic, or, that if that was a reality at some point, is how that lays out around those properties.
Like to be respectful of the homes that are
Absolutely.
there.
Yeah. I mean, and then they don't have a partial split. Their land isn't in their lot or right around their house isn't split. That would be very difficult in the future to deal with.
One of those property owners control this. So
but
if they wanted to do something at some point, they could kind of say, well, here's how we want to wiggle the road,
Well, it's not so much the road, it's the definition of the area that I'm more concerned about.
But
and the road, by the way.
They own primarily all the land as you're speaking to it. And to what it's noted is, if they were to develop in any form to do this agri-hood, they just need to connect to the north to a certain point. That's with what development happens to the north. You need to connect to Whalen and south of there to Old Indian. Where that actually resides on the land can be modified.
Okay. First of all, I would say keep the Jones farm the way it is. There's been a lot of opinion about that piece of land. And on the agri-hood, I was a little bit concerned about getting in and out from the roads, and the concept of it is very appealing, don't get me wrong, but there was talk, I think, at the Ag and Rural Committee, and Mark Jones has brought this concept up as well, that the idea of people using pesticides and so forth very close to residential land, that people moving into that neighborhood will need to be made aware of that. And it reminds me of, lead paint in buildings. And when you rent, they make you sign an acknowledgement form that you understand that this is present. And I think probably that's going to happen. I think it's going to need a lot more discussion and fleshing out, particularly by the Rural and Ag Committee and Plan Commission, as to what will be allowed and what won't. And I think it'd be lovely to have even a community garden. But if you went with a community garden, then who regulates what? Who controls what? I'm not sure how the community gardens work in the Jamestown neighborhood, but I think we should be sort of flexible. But I would like to see something like that in the middle, just to kind of bring that side of the neighborhood together around something that they support and that they enjoy. It's not like a recreation or park. It's something that's more farming oriented.
And Elizabeth, the devil will be in the details. You can certainly say, well, all right, we don't want any pesticides in there, and someone says, great, no problem. I'm going to put in an organic hog operation. And under ag zoning, you can do that right now.
As I look at the aerial photo of what's there right now, there's barely any ag use right now in that area. There's a bunch of woodlands, there's a bunch of just open space. It's kind of a state residential right now. I like the idea of agrihood. It doesn't seem highly plausible to me that it would be converted, but I would be supportive of keeping it in there as an option. I hear the concerns of like, well, what kind of ag are we really talking about? I think it is more of the community garden variety than something, any kind of conventional commercial ag. It'd be much more like boutique type ag, oriented toward community residents, and so having a little policy content in there, assuring that any ag use is restricted enough to be compatible with a neighborhood all the way around it makes sense to me.
Well, those are the primary questions we had in the memo, but open again to any other questions you may have of what you see here. We have a direction. If there's follow-up, especially on trails, which is kind of a newer thing, please don't hesitate to pass that on to staff and they'll get to me. And again, this would be not final. This is just where we're going to be looking at engineering of how it's impacted by this development. So there's still a process that we're going through all the way likely to at least to March at the path that we're at now. But again, is there any other additional questions or comments about what we're seeing here?
Can you talk a little bit, I know that I know we have protected or open lands and so forth on the south end. There are also places of woodlands. Can you talk a little bit about, developers, because we have a tree advisory policy, and how that would work if there was a person putting a development in there and what they would have to do?
So the city does have a tree advisory committee, and last year we passed an ordinance that requires a tree preservation plan at the time of preliminary plat. So when a developer comes forward and with an intention to develop houses or do commercial development, one of the things that we will request is a tree preservation plan. That tree preservation plan locates all of the high quality trees and allows staff and the plan commission to work together with the developer to protect those trees.
Can you define high quality trees, please?
Yes. They are a certain list of trees, which includes oaks, I think maple, hickory, and all that means is mulberry trees, weed trees are not included as high quality trees.
We've also been working, I'm on the tree advisory committee. We've been working on diversifying our inventory as well. And so I think that will only grow, and clearly ash trees are not on there because of emerald ash borer. So.
Steve, I just want to comment that I really appreciate the approach you took with the interchange here. I think this is a plan that is not dependent on an interchange. It may never occur. We don't know whether it will, but this is a plan that can work if it doesn't happen, but also doesn't preclude it from happening. And I know that was a tough thing that you wrestled with, and appreciate that.
Thank you. And staff. Thank you for working through that. I think we'll go on to the next step here of public comment.
Yes, at this time, I would like to open up public comment for anyone who wishes to speak. Right now, I do have 4 of my sheets. Please feel free to maybe to bring another one up to me if there's anyone else would like to speak. But Jeremy's just checking on the microphones here. And we'll bring up Mr. Dwayne Craig first then.
I live at 2404 West Hill Drive, and my concern is I'm not too pleased with the idea of having the trail reach in from the west into the West Hill Drive area, because it'll bring more traffic in the area and who knows what, maybe even some crime and security concerns. But I'm also much concerned about how it enters the area there. It looks like it doesn't come into the cul-de-sac. And so I'm concerned about our neighbor friend there, how that might be too close to their property and affect them, and maybe they wouldn't have a proper buffer, so they'll have traffic on 2 sides of them, and we're concerned about their welfare and the value of their property. Also, that cul-de-sac might end up being a stopping off point, and other neighbors in the cul-de-sac might find that things that are going on there that they wish didn't. But that's being negative, but never you know what could happen. And then as far as the park area, if the bicycles come in from all around the area, far away many times, and want to congregate in the park, there's a restroom there and a shelter. Are the other people around the park, have they been contacted to see whether there's a concern there about it? Maybe it's nothing to be concerned. Maybe they're used to it because it's a park. But I just think it's something that it'd be nice to know how they feel about it. I also wonder if the reason why, I wonder if these criteria for how many people have to move into the area, what is that? Who determined that? And does that have anything to do with the influx of immigrants into the country? Is it driven by that to some extent? But what is this determined at the county level or state level or federal? What's behind the determination of these limits? So just one other thing I was curious about. We never hear anything mentioned about solar farms. Is that considered an agricultural thing, or is that a business or industrial consideration? But something that someone might want to address sometime. So thank you.
Else who would like to reach out to staff and I, we'd be happy to respond to those specific questions. We're not able to respond to all the specific questions this evening at this meeting, but feel free to reach out and we're happy to respond to specific questions. So thank you. Mr. Andrew Lager.
Hello, I'm Andrew Lager. I live on West Hill Drive. I wanted to say, is it Jason? I don't know. I didn't quite get your name. Very grateful you're here. I believe you're not on the steering committee, but you're here in a capacity to bring your expertise and your acumen to this. And I'm very grateful for the insight you've shared. Also, our alders and Elizabeth and others are very grateful for your insight. There have been drastic changes. We've seen those. I'm concerned, if I speak to Jason, you have a lot of insight here. Looking at Connector B, looking at that, Collector B, I don't know if people were aware. We've talked about stormwater issues, but Collector B essentially goes right at that section where that really flows through. So I'm kind of concerned how that Collector B came to fruition. if they talked with the city attorney about that, the city engineer about that in regards to the water flow, because that looks like a lot of water flow going down through stormwater to the south. And I have a limited capacity and understanding of it. There's a lot of watershed issues and stormwater issues. So we're glad you're here, Jason, to kind of bring some added insight to that. Sounds like you have a lot of experience in that, and you've seen that around the county. So that's a pretty major concern here. We've been, I didn't see that addressed. I just see that collector B on the map, which was new to us, as you've seen the slides. And there's a significant amount of water runoff that comes through there through neighbors' properties, flooding, and it goes through there. So, things have changed. It brings up 12 new or dozens of new, more complexities here. So, my doctor says I'm in good health. I could hang around for another 80 years to this plan to evolve. So we've got time. So thank you. There's time. Let's not rush the process. I know you're talking about months and March coming around the corner, but this just created a whole nother scenario of timing that are major issues, just major issues. So there's a lot of questions in that, and I tried to stay on Collector B. So Collector B, the watershed, the issues, there's a lot to work through here. Thank you for your time, and I'm glad you're here to see these topics. Thank you.
Marianne Lager, next, please.
Can we just dwell on that a bit? Because I am seeing what he's seeing. I'm seeing Collector B come down a hill from Wayland and go downhill and then empty its water onto Irish Lane. And I know that there was many comments about stormwater flooding already. So I know that I've been assured that maybe we're going to talk about stormwater flooding coming up. So I want to let people know that there will be future meetings on that. And then some of the related issues that are happening right now, I've said to people, we need to start dealing with this now, because this is a FUDA. This could happen decades from now. We can't really wait decades. I think the city needs to get on top of it. They had the Curry Court flooding study. Go look it up on the city website. There was a whole page, and I mean, just lots of stuff that they uncovered there. And it's related because there is a lot of wetlands kind of permeating our area. And we have the Irish Lane reconstruction project coming up in 2028. And so I think some of the stuff we need to maybe start to think about, is there infrastructure to make us more resilient from the stormwater flooding? Thank you.
Hi, I just have a couple of questions, and I know that this has been a concern by a number of people in the neighborhood, and so I just wanted some clarification regarding sidewalks and gutters and sewers in the neighborhood of Greenfield, because I've heard a lot of concerns regarding that and costs, and that I know it's not very welcomed in the neighborhood. And so I was wondering where those were going to be going, if they're going, and hopefully not from our neighborhood perspective, but also a concern regarding the sewer hookup and if that's a requirement and how that would work, and the costs, and if there's any funding that would help with that, and the zoning that might be affecting that as well. For example, if someone's septic was to fail before development, but they're before a road was planned to be put in a sewer, or we don't know when it's going to happen, and yet someone's sewer or septic is failing, and they go and replace it, and then 2 years later they put in the sewer and say, hey, you have to now hook up, after they just spent $10,000 to $20,000 putting in a septic. So just wondering how that would work, especially regarding any changes in zoning. And that was part of my second question regarding zoning. Since this, if I don't know, I'm not familiar with housing terms and that kind of stuff, like maybe my husband is, who's an appraiser, but So my understanding is that these plans are for rezoning of the area. So is that rezoning us from rural into now urban? And so that was a question as well. And does that become immediate upon approval of these plans? Because that would also affect potential, I think, septic replacements of anyone that needs to replace before development was put in. So that was a question. And then a second question, too, that I heard about tonight about amendments to the plan, that a developer can come in and say, hey, this isn't working, we'd like to amend the plan. So one of the questions that I had was, so this is the plan that's being approved, so down the road, 10 years from now, when developers are coming through, can they just come through and come to the city and say, hey, we don't like this, can we change it? And do something completely different from what was originally planned. So I was just wondering about that as well. So.
Thank you. Mr. Mark Jones.
Deanna, are you going to address those questions? Because I have those same questions.
I'm taking notes.
Okay.
We will address questions. We'll probably put out a question answer. Is going to be the easiest way to do it.
Okay.
We'll write up answers.
Okay, thank you.
For the last one though, for like comp plan amendments can happen throughout the, I think that's a fair question. Council doesn't take it very lightly and it has to pass a lot of committees. But that changes can be made to the comprehensive plan. You have to follow a lot of steps, but in every single municipality, that's how that works. And your elected officials, that's why reaching out to them and saying like, hey, I don't really support this amendment, or I really hope you vote in support of that, is super important. And Deanna can give a much more exhaustive answer in the follow-up. But just to address that question, because I feel like all of your questions were fair, but I happen to know the answer to that one, so I wanted to give you the answer.
Mark Jones, 2266 South Sain Road. I do farm, and my farm has above average soils, just an FYI for you. The city paid $150,000 for a plan that nobody so far has been really thrilled about. But the plan is going to get passed because the consultant is going to create it and they're going to get paid. My question is, we are doing the conceptual plan and then we're going to do how we pay for it and the sewer water extension later. Was that included in the $150,000 we paid, or is that another ripoff for us to pay some more in a later date? Because no one so far has been really thrilled with what's been presented. So in case you missed that memo. Along those lines, the sewer and water extension, to extend the sewer and water to the south from where it's at now, it's got to come through the Haas farm and through the Hartong area. And there's large springs just across from Snowman's driveway on the Haas property. That is the headwaters of one of the branches of the Swan Creek that feeds Lake Wabisa. But nobody seems to have done much work on looking at what would cost or would it ruin those springs by digging through them. And it's a shame that we didn't address some of this stuff first. I think we have the cart before the horse. Thank you.
Could I ask a question to that? This might have been discussed before I was on council, so my apologies if this has already happened. Can you explain where like an environmental impact assessment happens in this process, if that has already happened?
Environmental impact assessments are may be done for some projects that come through. It's not something that the city requires. Most environmental impact assessments are done whenever there's federal funds involved.
But to maybe clarify the intent of that question, before development occurs, there are technical analyses beyond what we're doing in this process that need to figure out where are the edges of wetlands, where does the water go. There is a bunch of environmental work that happens.
Yes, I should have clarified. Yes. Yeah. So a developer will do significant research into grades, topographies, under soil levels, the soil profiles, the locations of wetlands. We've already talked about trees, where the water table is at springs. All of those factors get looked at, categorized, and is a key part of the design process.
Deanna, if I could, I'd like to do the same thing Nicole did and just offer the quick and dirty version of what you guys are going to follow up with later regarding the question of what happens when this plan is adopted. And I think the answer is initially nothing. It is laying the groundwork for how the city will react to then a landowner coming forward and proposing some sort of development. But it is not actually going to change anything initially.
That's an excellent way to put this. Once again, staff and the city goes to the plan when a developer and a landowner comes to us.
And that would be when a rezoning occurs, if at all, not when this plan is approved.
Yes, this is not a rezoning. This is solely looking at the future land use categories. So rezoning is something that would happen farther along in an actual development process. We are not rezoning any properties in Greenfield. Mr. Jamie Lynch.
Jamie Lynch, 5035 Burn Road. 52-year resident at that place there. My concerns is where Blaney Road comes out on Burn Road to the south. That roadway is directly across from my house. 2 years ago, there was a proposal for a wedding venue for that Giles Farm property. The gentleman brought it in front of City Council. It was denied for a few reasons. One of the main reasons is he had a driveway for that event center there, and it was not approved due to the fact of the traffic and the roadway of Burn Road and how dangerous that road is and the topography of it. The other thing is the railroad crossing is not a lit railroad crossing. It's an open crossing with no markers on it at all if there's a train coming through there. The other thing with the topography, I wish before they put the solar fields in, just south of there, they would have done an environmental impact report on that. As the water from that, the panels are not up yet, has flooded Murphy Creek numerous times already with no panels, and it's also washed out the railroad beds that way at the bottom of the hill that's there. So those are my concerns with it. I can't believe the previous gentleman that owned that sold that property now to the Giles. I would be furious if I knew I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars for a proposed event center. City Council denies it, and now the city is approving a roadway to that property and to that road. So those are just my concerns. I want to thank everyone on the steering committee and all you guys for taking the time to hear our views on this. Thank you.
Yeah, could I just add a little bit onto there? Because it is Adam Gill's property now, but prior to that, but it was owned by a gentleman that did propose a conference center that started to really kind of explode in design, and a lot of us were not happy with it, and it eventually was voted down. But I just want to put that out there so that people understand that. And so speaking with Adam, he is very content with what he's doing right now in terms of using that land for agricultural use, hunting, and so forth. So.
Mr. David Haight, if you'd like to come up and provide your comments.
Thank you. David Haight, 5855 Woods Edge Road. And I want to thank the commission members. I've spent a lot of time studying past neighborhood plans, and they've all been excellent. And I'm extremely impressed. And I thank you for your careful consideration, and I thank the staff for its professionalism. So I'm here to talk about the missing regulatory system that we don't talk about, which is the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act is central to everything that happens in planning, land use, and environmental protection, particularly in this area, because this area sits at the headwaters of Swan Creek and Murphy's Creek, which feeds one of the most environmentally sensitive areas in the state, which also happens to be one of the most protected under the Wisconsin statutes area in the state, the Wabisa Wetlands State Natural Area. Now, we don't talk about it in Fitchburg anywhere, essentially. But the fact of the matter is that when you cut through all the things that happen, the Dane County Water Quality Plan is an element of the Clean Water Act. It's a Section 208 land use plan. And the state legislature changed the criteria for amending the Dane County Water Quality Plan to be 100% and only whether water quality standards downstream and within this area will be protected. That has to be shown for the Regional Planning Commission to recommend that the DNR approve the amendment to expand the urban services boundary to include the Greenfield neighborhood. So I want to thank Mr. Allen, who as mayor led a team for the McGaw Park neighborhood plan, which was science first. They started with the science. They brought in hydrologists, wetland scientists, and they did studies of springs. And the entire area is groundwater-dependent eco-hydrological system. Without that science and having the proof of the impacts of the land development so far within the McGaw Park neighborhood plan, which was approved by the Regional Planning Commission, everything was supposed to be infiltrated. No net increase in runoff volume was the requirement. That hasn't been implemented, and I want to compliment the planning director because when she found out with regard to Hartung property that it was not a condition that applied to Hartung property, that it applied but had not been known to be part of what the requirement for Hartung was, she immediately added it to the plat requirements and also to the stormwater facility requirements. But what's going to happen here is you've got a situation where the DNR has developed, for example, there's been a very large study the DNR did with respect to the Wabisa wetlands and the impacts to the ecosystem services that are therein provided. All that science has to be hit. And I would like to just challenge the Plan Commission, the Regional Planning Commission, to develop watershed level assessments and not allow this piecemealing. That's the key. You hold the power and the duty under the law to do that level. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. I just want to point out we're the steering committee, we're not the plan commission, so we have limited powers here at this level, but I'm sure that suggestion will be noted.
That is all that I have for the half sheets. Is there? Okay.
Hello, everyone. I am Julia, the mayor of the city, and I want to say thank you for coming again tonight. And I want to say thank you for the steering committee for your, this long process. And I think what it was proposed tonight is a compromise from all the feedback that we got from you. I know that some of you are still against this process, but I think what is proposed tonight is a very good compromise from what we heard from the last meeting, what I think that we can move forward. So I want to say thank you to staff and to you. We have more to do, but I think this is a plan that we can move forward, and I want to say thank you. And thank you to Steve and your team too, okay?
Hey, Deanna. If I may, I'm sorry. One of the initial questions that was asked, it took me a second to find the answer, and I just wanted to respond to it. When the question was asked about why the need for housing has increased so much recently, and the question was around, like, are there a bunch of immigrants coming to cause that inflection? I found a Dane County regional housing report that just states that from 2010 to 2020, Dane County only permitted 34,000 new housing units when 42,000 new households called the county home. So I just want to identify it is a problem that we've kind of been building by not keeping up with pace that we're just now realizing. I think it is a fair question to just ask, like, why is it all of a sudden such an intense problem? And I think it's because the lack of new build is causing these problems to come home to roost. I just wanted to correct that it wasn't, we're not like seeing an influx of illegal immigrants or anything like that. It is people who move here to Dane County for jobs. I did so myself in 2010 from Texas. I moved here. So just wanted to restate that.
So why is all of these new houses Fitchburg's problem? Why do we have to support the county with all these? Can you step up to the mic? Can you step up to the mic?
So the question, I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it for those people who are watching. So the question was, why is it Fitchburg's responsibility to deal with all of the issues that the county is seeing in these numbers? And I think that's a fair question if we were saying Fitchburg alone had to deal with all of the housing shortages that are happening. But I don't think that's what we're saying. I think we're saying that we have people who love this community, who want to move here and want to join. And I myself made Fitchburg home. I haven't lived here for many, many years. So I think that's kind of what we're doing. We're not looking to solve all of the county's housing issues. But that's a fair question.
Well, I will once again offer a meeting or any input with staff, myself or Brad. Please feel free to reach out with your questions and concerns. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
Thank you all.